The Colours That Blind, Chapter 11, 22nd of March 1975. I haven't been able to write for some days now. I'm nervous all the time and I fear that these nerves might just become my new normal. This country is in the thick of guns and bullets. I have heard on the Bass's radiogram stories of comrades dying in Nyanga and in other reserves. The white men telling these stories say the security forces have the situation contained and are protecting the people. I wonder then, who are the people? Do they include us? I am anxious lately that someone will find out about my association with the comrades. I pray that no one ever finds this book, because if they do, I will have written my own death. But I feel as though this page is the only place I can truly be myself, the only place where I can write the things I am afraid to say. These last few days I have had to discreetly cook a meal of sadza and chicken for a group of hungry grown men, wait for one of the war boys picked from the village to fetch me and take me to whatever location the comrades are at. It isn't a daily thing because they always creep up and down the area, past the border just a little way away and into Mozambique where they train. But I have to always be ready in case word comes that they are around. I have to always be careful because no matter how much the village fears the comrades and might even support them, no one can be trusted. It feels as though I am now in the business of stocking anxiety. Today the Misses and Bass Rogers sipped some tea together with Teacher Edwards, the missionary I've heard so much about. Miss Judy, a niece of one of the Missis's friends, and two men whom I suspected were officials from the Rhodesian security forces. There was an older man they called General and a younger man with sharp eyes and a slow, lazy blink, whom I did not at first recognise. Strange things have always happened at Bass Rogers' farm for as long as I can remember. Lately this General, who is a middle-aged plump man with a tired and sagging belly, turns up at the house often in a white alpha suit. He sits out by the veranda with the Bass, sipping a glass of sherry and speaking in low tones. I am worried he will read the uneasiness on my face and see that I am trying to glean useful information for the comrades. Back when I was very young, I remember another old man who used to visit the Bass, talking to him by the trees in a dusty Peugeot, a map laid between them. Baba had once said he suspected that the Bass secretly worked with the security forces, allowing them to hide their weapons in his house and plotting routes to catch the comrades. The African terrorists. I agree with Baba. With all the people that the Bass hosts, he can't only be a farmer. The day blazed this afternoon, disassociating itself from the usual coolness of Vumba. What puzzles me is that in this heat, the white man still has his tea, dabbing at the sweat on his brow, yet voluntarily swallowing all that hot water. My eye glided to the younger official and stayed there as memories reeled in, dancing around the surprise I felt. I could never have forgotten him, even if I wanted to. Philip. The thought felt almost as daunting as the one I had of Matthew, because it brought back the unwelcome feelings of rage and shame. I stood there recounting to myself all those weekends and holidays Philip had spent at the farmhouse with Matthew. "Oh, Judy, I love your new hair. You always look so trendy. That nephew of mine must come and see you for himself," the missus had said. "Oh, thank you," the young woman had simpered. "I saw it in one of those magazines and I knew I had to have it." I had to stop myself from frowning. Her hair was a big puffy blonde show that looked almost like mine, but somehow hers was acceptable and I was to remember that this was not a zoo. "Rosie, what are you standing there gawping at Judy for?" I awoke from my daydream, realising all eyes were now on me because of that question. I looked down and shuffled back into the house in the direction of the kitchen. I looked at my reflection in the silver metal rims of the Missis's pot as I waited for the water to boil on the stove. I tucked in a few standing hairs along my hairline and patted them down into my neatly flattened cornrows. The last time the Missis had made such a fuss about my afro. Although I had plaited the cornrows loosely, they would at least buy me peace for a few days. I slid the pated scones I'd baked earlier onto the tray and marched to the veranda where they laughed and dabbed their sweat, stealing one last glance at my hair as I passed the small mirror in her corridor. The radiogram was playing in the background and puffs of cigarette smoke spiralled up from the Bass and the two officials. The Missis sat there fanning herself, a glass of icy water by her legs. Ian Smith was being interviewed again. I've heard him before saying exactly what he was saying today. The Bass stood up and marched into the house, turned the knob of the radiogram until the sound carried itself outside and returned to his seat. They all fell silent and listened as the American interviewer asked him questions. Once upon a time, Prime Minister, you said you'll never see a black rule in this country in your lifetime. Do you still stand by that? Yes, I believe that was a fair comment. I think that if we ever got to a stage of having black rule, then our policy would have failed. Now, I have heard many experts say that the constitution we produced here is one of the most complicated ones that the world has ever seen. Now, how can you ask a mass of people who don't understand what even a simple constitution is whether they approve of a complicated one and whether they think it's the right one or not for their country? This is the predicament we find ourselves in. Well, that's the problem of all democracies, Mr. Smith. Democracy, as I understand it, is not a political intelligence test, thank God. Otherwise, we would all be run by professors from universities. But it is a means of saying no. Don't you think in Rhodesia, like in any other country, most of the people who vote on the basis of whether they think well of you and whether they think you can lead them well? The general curled his lip and tapped at his cigarette with a serious expression. I think he's a little younger than Baba, although his face is already starting to sag. He straightened up in his chair, tapped the butt of his cigarette, and shot me a glance as he intervened. These journalists don't understand what we're trying to do here. What they don't see is how ungrateful and greedy these blacks are. We have given them all this land in the reserves and in the townships without them earning it, and still they complain. What else do they need? Why is no one talking about how the whites are being killed? I kept my eyes from him as he went on. And these terrorists are only becoming more relentless, aren't they? This is why we called you here, Edwards. It's time for you and your mission friends to move away, go back home or to Umtali, anywhere but here. The locals don't even want you here. Teacher Edwards, sitting in what seemed like a hovering cloud of smoke coming from the general, smiled. I kept my lip from curling. Missionaries. Baba always talks of how the Bible led the gun here. Yet Amai is still smitten by them, always going on about how supportive they are and singing the praises of Teacher Edwards and the others every time she goes to Sunday service. The way she speaks of them, it's almost as though they are not like the rest of the land hoarders. With all due respect, sir, I believe we still have work to do here. I'm assured we're planting a seed. In my heart, I scoffed. What arrogance! Even the General and the Bass looked at each other and laughed. Bass Rogers spoke. Oh, these eager young boys. What seed would that be, Edwards? I, too, was interested in finding out what seed he thought he was planting. I watched the teacher out of the corner of my eye as he fidgeted in his seat, somehow isolated like a young kudu surrounded by a herd of lions. But even so, he calmly took a sip of his tea, almost seeming in control of himself. I don't know that we can treat people the way we do in this country, denying them fairness while expecting things to stay in our favour. The mission school is important, sir, a benefit for both our government and the locals themselves, if you will, a way of balancing the scales. Locals need education and medical facilities, things they're being deprived of. They're people just like you. He reconsidered. My point is, if we keep isolating the locals, we run the risk of weakening the potential of this country that we all claim to love. There was a small silence while the general chewed on the teacher's words. It almost sounds convincing when you say it, he said eventually, pulling a whiff of smoke from his cigarette and blowing it right out. Tell me then, what happens if this cause of yours, this, what did you call it? Planting a seed, the Bass helped, leering and sipping on his tea. Yes, this seed planting. Tell me what happens if it then claims from you more than just your time and effort, eh? What will you do then, Edwards? The teacher swallowed and gave a faint smile. If it does, then so be it. The general smirked, relaxing into his chair with the cigarette still held between his fingers. Be careful there, Edwards. I hear this god of yours is in the business of testing people. Silence. I trotted back into the house and carefully poured the boiling water into the little white teapot that the missus liked before marching back to the veranda where the men were still talking. Aye, Rogers, I meant to tell you. We have this security system now that we're giving to all the whites. It's a kind of an alert that links your house to our police camp in Umtali. I personally haven't seen anything like it. The general paused again, blowing out a puff of smoke. He glanced at me with a cup of tea in his hand. You never know, do you? What these terrorists are up to, what they can do. You never know who they are or who they're working with. At that very moment, my eyes met his, and just as quickly, my right hand lost control of the teapot I had in my hand, allowing it to tip recklessly, dumping hot water into Bass Rogers' lap. We both yelped. I guess him because of the pain he had endured, and me for the shock and the pain to come. "You stupid, stupid girl!" All of them, every single one, turned their eyes on me. My heart rocked wildly. I watched the Bass blazing with anger as he whisked me to my feet with his hand on my neck. He pinned me to the wall, his fingers tight against my throat. Everything went quiet and still, and in my ears I could hear the clear sound of Amai singing peacefully. It was almost as though she was an angel singing me home. My vision slowly crept away from me before suddenly returning as I collapsed into the arms of Teacher Edwards, panting desperately for air. "I told you these blacks are trouble," the General said, sipping his tea as though he had not just seen a woman almost killed in front of him. As Teacher Edwards helped me to stand, I tried calming my racing heart and trembling hands. Bass Rogers now sat back in his chair, speaking as though nothing had happened. I wondered for a second if my brain had just played a trick on me. Had I made it up and lived the horror of it in my head? Because apart from my shaking hands, everything seemed as it should be. In the corner, Philip puffed on a cigarette, staring into the distance, his face registering no hint of a care. The missus continued with her fanning, an old magazine upon her lap. Just another day at the farm. Then, as though vouching for the reality of the moment, Teacher Edwards inquired after me, reminding me of what had just happened. My eyes drifted to Bass Rogers and the red skin on his right leg where the hot water had scalded him, now being dabbed with ice wrapped in a towel. I looked down, filled with shame for some reason, and walked back in the house.